Well, first off, thank you all for being here and for reminding Congress that there is a lot to be gained from from federal investments in research and development, and that one of the reasons I feel so strongly about this is that I'm best known as being the only scientist in Congress, but I'm also a businessman. When I was 19 years old, my little brother and I started a company in our basement with $500 from my parents, and that company now, well, and then actually after a little while, my dad kicked us out of the basement, so we moved up to my bedroom. And then when we got our first order, we moved into a tiny little metal building in a cornfield, and now it's a great big building, great big metal building in a cornfield, and just went over 1,000 people. We manufacture in the Midwest, and something I'm very proud of. And it makes about 70% of all the theater lighting equipment in the United States. So we're 90% of the lights on Broadway, and 50% of touring rock and roll, and just 70% of churches, schools, community theaters. And for those of you who've been to Disneyland or Disney World, when I back in my 20s, I designed and programmed the control system for the Disneyland Main Street Electrical Parade, which is, I guess, the most interesting thing for when I describe this to young kids. But all of this had to do with technology. Our firm was born at the birth of the microprocessor era. And there's if you talk to Silicon Valley people today, they have this sort of mythology that, it was a bunch of people went off in garages. And if you actually look at it, it was all federal contracts that developed all of the technology for integrated circuits, and that really did that. Contracts with NASA, contracts with, research contracts. And so this federal investments in research pay off at all different time scales. Sometimes there's an immediate product that's, going to hit the market soon, and that's what these presentations are about. Other things, have to do with, like immunotherapy, the thing that is now making headlines for all the miracle cures for cancers that used to be uncurable. I gave a floor speech not too long ago outlining the pyramid of federally funded research that led finally to immunotherapy and related things, and just the understanding of our immune system, which is one of the things here, is just encountering, it's reached such an incredible stage of understanding. And there's a whole row of unoccupied seats in the front for those of you standing up in the back. But anyway, I just want to thank all you here, because this is a message that Congress has to hear, and has to hear often. You can be a hero by cutting the research budget this year, and the economic damage that does, doesn't play out in the next election, but it plays out in the decades to come. And at which point you just blame it on the other party, and so you have to, it's almost a design failing of democracy, that all of the political incentives are near term, and that causes us to systematically underinvest in things with long-term payoffs, like federally funded research. And so making sure that everyone who works in these buildings here understands that those investments pay off not only 20 years from now, but will pay off in the sort of startup operations you're hearing about today. So thank you. I'm really proud to be the co-sponsor with Representative Comstock of this bipartisan caucus, because this should not be a partisan issue, and so we're working hard to avoid that. Anyway, thank you all, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you.
We introduced you in absence.
Oh, you did? Well, I'm glad, not knowing what was said about me, I'm honored to be here, and hope that it set the stage for a warm welcome. But Senator Coons and I are delighted. We co-chair the competitive caucus. If you need evidence that Republicans and Democrats find opportunities to work together, Chris and I are, I think, a good example of that, but there's many others, and we want to see more of that, not less of that. Science, incidentally, is a place that can bring us together, and we want to make sure that that's the case, and we still believe that facts matter, and we're delighted to join you today in this in a bipartisan way to talk about the importance of what science can bring to our country. Chris and I created the competitive caucus, a desire to have our country's economy grow, to make sure that the United States of America is competitive in a global economy. And one of the things that we recognize is the significant value of scientific research Chris and I are both supporters, and we work hard at making certain that the federal government, the taxpayer commitment to scientific research is fulfilled. And we care a lot about, I'm a member, we're both members of the Appropriations Committee, and when it comes to NIH and to NSF and the Department of Defense, I actually have a goal for my state, and we have a scientist here from Lawrence, Kansas, that exemplifies what I hope happens in my home state. I want young men and women of Kansas who are interested in science and mathematics and engineering and research to not only have an education, but to have a career path, and that Kansas is and remains their home as a result of greater opportunities. And so the more we can invest in science, the better I believe my state will be, and the greater opportunities it has. I look at a primary responsibility of all of us as citizens of the country, and mine's no different than yours, but one of those responsibilities, just civic responsibilities, is to see that the American dream is alive and well, and research science is a way that we can continue to enhance the opportunities that Americans have for good things to happen in their economic and personal lives. NIH, I think, is a great example of scientific research that brings people together. You can be for NIH funding if you are only interested in saving money, an investment that has a great return, because we can invest money in science, medical research, and we will reduce the cost of healthcare. You can be the most caring and compassionate person, and I don't mean to suggest that those two individuals are mutually exclusive, but you can be only interested in making sure that we cure cancer, and you can find a great results from scientific research. So we believe, Chris and I understand that the value of science in keeping America a competitive place in a global economy is at the forefront, and we want to make sure that we do everything that enhances the chances that science is honored and esteemed. I also would say, perhaps as an aside, that in my view, science gives the opportunity for policymakers like me to have better answers to difficult questions. So not only is this beneficial to our economy, but it's beneficial to our understanding of the world, so that decisions that we make have more value and have greater consequence, better consequence to the citizens we represent. And I'm particularly glad to have I don't know who I'm looking at, the Lawrence, Kansas. No, thank you. I do. It's good to see you. Thank you. What a success story, and we're delighted to have you on the panel to tell a story, and we'd be glad to have any other scientists, researchers, and economic folks who create economic opportunities to arrive in our state, and particularly at the home of the University of Kansas. We want to be known, we can't at the moment be known for a football program, but we can be known as a place in which science is pursued and discoveries are made. So thank you all for allowing me to join you, and I hope this afternoon is productive for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you. Excuse me. I'm not quite as svelte as the senator from Kansas. To Anna Quieter and to the Science Coalition, to this fabulous and talented panel, and to my great friend, Jerry Moran of Kansas. Thank you, Jerry, for being a good partner in the Competitiveness Caucus, something that we launched because we saw there was not one area to focus on all the different components of competitiveness globally, to look at tax, trade, intellectual property, innovation, immigration, other policy areas that if we don't get them right, we can reasonably predict that the United States will not be as secure and prosperous and promising a country as it's been. And federal investment in R&D is an absolutely linchpin piece of our being a competitive society going forward. I'm thrilled to have a strong relationship with the University of Delaware, Delaware State University, UD. Earlier this week, we did a groundbreaking on a very exciting building where a whole lot of federally funded R&D is going to be underway going forward. But I'm also encouraged that your report quantifies and makes specific and concrete some of the positive outcomes of federal investment in university-based research. I was struck to see that half of basic research in the United States happens at universities. We have this amazing constellation of national laboratories. There is also a lab caucus in the Senate, of which I'm a member. There isn't yet a national lab in Delaware, but give us time. Since Jerry and I are both appropriators, we make inside jokes like that, forgive me. But funding fundamental science and fundamental science that's done at universities and having it translate into the marketplace and having it help create jobs is an absolutely essential part of what we support and what you do. Your report highlights the creation of nearly 9,000 jobs across a constellation of federally funded research projects. I'm here in part to welcome GenPro and to say thank you for growing out of NSF-sponsored research at the University of Delaware and revolutionizing the way we treat and diagnose chronic and life-threatening diseases, including cancer. On a personal note, I just finished having lunch with the hemo-oncologist who treated my father, just to say thank you for the very good care he gave my father before he passed. And one of the things we talked about, not surprisingly, was the importance of investing in cutting-edge research so that other families have a better shot at better outcomes going forward. I was friends with someone who was a hemo-oncologist 30 years ago, and the change in outcomes in just my lifetime is simply stunning. The numbers that I just heard from Dr. Gladstone from Hopkins about the survival rates for bone marrow transplants and the treatments, the cures and the technologies that are possible today. The word cure and leukemia did not appear in the same sentence 30 years ago with any frequency. Today, it is commonplace, and they're pushing the very boundaries of what's possible. That is just one of many, many examples, lavishly illustrated here, of what federal funding in basic science applied through universities and through your hands-on work and then turned loose into the marketplace can make possible. There are some reasons to be concerned. We are up against active, even aggressive foreign competitors. ITIF recently came out with a study that said the United States ranks 22nd globally in federal investment in university-based research. That's almost hard to believe. That's not in absolute dollars, that's in percentage dollars, but it is still, in terms of ranking, a suggestion that our competitors see the promise of university-based federally funded research, and they're taking it. And we are increasingly falling behind in our funding of university research. It also, frankly, doesn't help that the administration's budget this year, their initial budget proposal, fairly harshly cut federal R&D to its lowest level, non-defense R&D to its lowest level in 40 years. Had those initial proposed budget cuts been fully enacted, we would have seen non-defense R&D cut by more than $14 billion, or almost 20%, the NIH by 18%, the DOE by 60%, and the NSF by double digits, but that's just 11%. Thankfully, Republicans and Democrats on the appropriations committees of the Senate and the House worked together to reject these cuts, to restore this funding, and in fact, in some cases, like NIH, to significantly increase funding over what was proposed in the budget. But that doesn't mean that that work is over. I was reflecting over lunch about how when I was coming out of my undergraduate training as a chemistry major, the fact that there was significant new federal investment in physics, Strategic Defense Initiative, led a number of my classmates to pursue careers in particle physics and in beams and lasers and so forth, but that there wasn't significant new investment in my discipline in chemistry led many of us to decide to instead pursue something else like, oh, I don't know, politics. And it sends important signals. If there is not long-term predictable investment in university-based research, it makes it difficult to attract, to train, to motivate, and then to have them launch businesses and futures. So I'm not just an advocate for funding, I'm an advocate for sustained and predictable funding. I have no problem with accountability about the consequences and impact of funding. I think it is one of the worst canards of Washington that folks sometimes think that university-funded research doesn't have some dramatic compounding consequence for our society. Any rational evaluation of the technology advances of the last 30 years will find their foundations, their roots in university research, which if you had seen the title of the initial paper might have seemed unguided or unfocused. That's the essence of discovery. Discovery is doing guided, thorough, thoughtful, and appropriate research and stumbling across things that can literally transform our world. But if we don't support the very capable and talented scientists who do that work in the constellation of world-leading universities in our country, we won't benefit from the life-saving techniques and pharmaceuticals and treatments, from the new materials, from the world-changing technologies that today, from GPS to email, are part of our daily lives. So in closing, let me say that it's been a joy and an honor to work with Senator Moran. We just introduced a clean energy financing bill yesterday called the Master Limited Partnership Parity Act. Falls trippingly off the tongue after 6 years of trying. It was covered in the Washington Post this morning. It makes light reading on your way home. But we've also done work on commercialization, on SBIRs, on NSF, on the R&D tax credit. It's been a real joy to work with Senator Moran, a conservative Republican from Kansas, partnering up with a progressive Democrat from Delaware. This doesn't get covered in the press, folks, so we thought we'd give you a live demonstration of the fact we actually know each other, like each other, and are committed to sustaining long-term federal investment in university-based R&D. So thank you. If you'll forgive me, I have to go talk to Bloomberg TV about the MLP Parity Act. Thank you for coming today, and thank you for listening.
Welcome to today's briefing. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Anna Quiter. I'm the Vice President of the Science Coalition, and I'm also the Director of Federal Relations for Northern Illinois University. The Science Coalition is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization of more than 50 research universities nationwide. We work to strengthen federal funding for basic scientific research across the spectrum of scientific disciplines because this research and all the benefits that flow from it are essential to society and to our economic well-being as a country. So I hope everyone was able to pick up a copy of the Science Coalition's Sparking Economic Growth Report on your way in. If not, we still have plenty of copies. In this report, we identify 102 companies, which we call American Innovation Success Stories. And they grew out of federally funded university research and are today bringing to market truly transformational innovations. They're creating jobs and helping to stimulate the economy. The founders and leaders of 8 of those companies are here with us today to talk about their innovations and experiences. Leading our discussion today is Orin Herskowitz. He's the Senior Vice President of Intellectual Property and Technology Transfer at Columbia University. Take it away, Orin.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Are these live? These are live. That was live. Okay, great. Thanks very much. I'm really honored to be here today, and thanks to the Science Coalition and our Senate hosts for making this possible. I joined the university world 11 years ago. I was at the Boston Consulting Group before that, so I come from industry. I don't have a science background. And I was really flabbergasted by the depth and breadth of the kind of science that was being done at the American universities. The kind of basic research from new therapy, from the medical field, sequencing, clean energy, advanced materials, cybersecurity, software, photonics, graphene, all these fields that all on one campus and under one roof was truly amazing. I also had no idea how commercially relevant this theoretically basic science often turns out to be. When I think just from the example of Columbia, we see around 400 inventions a year from our faculty and graduate student inventors, of which about 110 end up getting licensed to industry, including between 20 and 25 patent-backed startups every year. So while the inventors often went down this path purely for the idea of pushing the boundaries of knowledge and training the next generation of scientists, a shockingly high percentage of this basic research ends up being tremendous commercial potential. You can look at that if you look across the panel we have here and across the universities in the US. Just last year alone, there were over 1,000 startup companies founded based largely on federally funded research at the universities. So it's an amazing depth. But when you hear these numbers, it's easy to lose track of what they actually mean. So when we say 1,000 startup companies, every one of those is working on the kind of invention that has a real potential to be transformative, to save and improve people's lives, to generate jobs in the local communities, to generate taxes and exports and keep America competitive. And so it's those kind of stories that we want to try and get at today to give an illustration of the kinds of companies that are trying to change the world based on federally funded research in American universities. So with that in mind, I'm going to turn things over to our panel. But with apologies, we have a lot of people on the panel, which is great. People flew in from all over the country for this. We're a little tight on time, therefore. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to stick to roughly 2 minutes for the introduction. And Sue will be playing time cop. So pardon if we come across as slightly rude. So for the first question, if you could just introduce yourself, introduce the company, where was the research funded, what's the problem you're trying to solve? If you succeed, what will be different about the world? And sort of where are you in that journey? That would be great. And if you could also just mention the university you're coming out of. So I'll start with Jack.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name's Jack O'Toole. Dartmouth chemistry professor Joe Belbruno and I founded FreshAir Sensor. At FreshAir, we develop sensors to detect, develop and commercialize sensors to detect hazardous chemicals, airborne or waterborne chemicals. The first two sensors we're focused on are nicotine and a component of burned marijuana. We put these sensors in a device, so customers right now buy our devices, use our app to connect the device to our cloud-based monitoring platform, and then we monitor areas for them. So when smoking takes place, they get an alert saying they're smoking in room 307 or apartment 215. Then we send them a chart, time-coded chart, showing a measurement of that substance, so they have scientific proof that smoking took place. So our customers are hotels, property management companies, any place people don't want other people to smoke. Like there's a guy that calls us all the time, we're not ready to serve, who owns a company that delivers gasoline, and his drivers are always smoking in and around the trucks, which, you know, he feels is a big concern since it could destroy a neighborhood, and the drivers keep doing it. But and we're developing other sensors for industrial chemicals and other hazardous substances that people want to detect. My partner Joe got grants from NSF from 98 to 2007. And back then he was trying to detect amino acids. They were trying to determine if there's life places. So he was trying to find different ways to detect amino acids. And he fortunately learned a lot about these things called molecularly imprinted polymers that he realized he could extrapolate to detect other kinds of things. So that's really what we work with now is molecularly imprinted polymers, so we can detect all sorts of different things. It's a nice platform to build from that came out of that NSF-funded research. And right now we have 21 people full-time at the company. We're growing pretty fast. We're in the process of hiring more people right now. We have products out there. We're in 25 or 26 states right now, our devices, and growing all the time. They're shipping devices out every day to people. So, I mean, you know, we're building a company that's going to protect people from bad stuff.
Great, thank you.
All right, my name is Robin Betier. I was a research scientist at the University of Illinois in Champaign, Urbana, and now I'm the president of Network Perception. We are a software development and commercialization company. We started 3 years ago, and we developed an application that can help strengthen the resiliency of critical infrastructure in terms of cybersecurity. As you can imagine, any enterprise, any infrastructure is under constant pressure with cyber attacks. And so if you have the smallest misconfiguration or problems in the way you're configuring what's called the firewalls, which are protecting your networks, then those can be exploited, and then the consequences can be dramatic. We all rely on, of course, electricity for the society, and so we want to make sure that no one outside of those utilities can penetrate the network and then switch breakers or turn off power lines. So the technology that we're commercializing was developed at the University of Illinois and can read configuration files from those firewalls, build a model and a visual map of the network, and really help to automate all the audit process and instantly check for those misconfigurations and problems. We have now a team of 10, and we're growing. The research was funded by several agencies. So I was looking at the lineage of funding we received. We started with the Department of Energy, DOE, and then Department of Homeland Security, DHS. And then recently we got an SBIR from the National Science Foundation, from NSF.
Thank you. Jeb.
Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity to participate here. My name is Jeb Connor. I'm chairman, CEO of a company called Genome Profiling. We go by GenPro. We're based on a technology that we out-licensed from the University of Delaware. It was invented by my partner and chief science officer at GenPro, whose name is Adam Marsh. Adam was the beneficiary of a National Science Foundation grant back in the early 2000s. Interestingly, that grant was to enable him to study under the polar ice cap the ability for invertebrate worms to survive and thrive as a population. His investigation was looking at the cellular activities and genomic activities that allowed for that. It involved him creating a statistical platform to evaluate that. That is the core technology to GenPro. Interestingly enough, the genome of an invertebrate worm and the genome of a human are about 92% similar. And his epiphany occurred several years ago, indicating that, gee, this could be translatable into a technology to really drive improvements in health. GenPro is a company that specializes in a new class of biomarkers called epigenetic biomarkers. Those biomarkers can be used to identify patients who respond to a particular drug from those that do not, responders versus non-responders. So our mission is to accelerate the expectations of precision medicine. Likewise, it can be used to identify disease prior to its symptomatic occurrence. So early treatment, better care, lower healthcare costs. And to Senator Kuhn's comment about immuno-oncology, we are able to identify the impact of tumors on the immune system and pick that up in blood samples. So a lot of our engagements right now with the biopharmaceutical companies is to help them better understand the mechanisms of actions that are creating some of these miracle drugs. We're a team of 5. It's a very computational intensive business. We expect to grow to in the neighborhood of 35 people over the next couple of years. Our funding to date has been through seed funding and some initial angel funding, and we're right in the middle now of raising a fairly significant Series A round.
Great. Thank you. So Arctic worms to curing cancer, that's quite a journey.
Quite a journey.
Carmela.
Hi, not so exotic, but I'm Carmela Abraham. I'm a professor of biochemistry and pharmacology at Boston University School of Medicine. I've been studying Alzheimer's disease for 37 years now. And as you heard from Senator Coons, there are many diseases that we are dealing with them much better, such as cancer, some cardiovascular diseases, but not with Alzheimer's disease. And the incidence of the disease is growing as our population ages. So as part of my studies, as a result of my studies that were funded by NIH, the National Institute of Aging, I'm the co-founder of Klogene Therapeutics, which is working on an Alzheimer's disease drug. The company is funded by a $1.5 million SBIR grant, innovation grant, and has 6 employees that some are full-time and some part-time. The drug we are developing has potential in a number of other neurodegenerative diseases as well as in multiple sclerosis. The original research was funded by the NIA also, and the number of the grant was AG for aging 0001, which was the first grant given by the National Institute of Aging to do research on the aging of the brain. This is for a period of over 20 years. My lab discovered that a certain gene called Klotho, named after a Greek goddess that spins the thread of life, does not function as well as we age. The reason the gene was named Klotho after this goddess was because mice that don't have the gene, they have many signs of human aging, such as arteriosclerosis, osteoporosis, hair loss, infertility, but also cognitive decline and loss of nerve cells in the brain. And mice that have more of this gene, they can live longer by 30%. So instead of 2 years, they live 3 years. So this gene is both a cognitive enhancer and a life-expanding gene, which is very important. So the research that followed in our lab showed that increasing the activity of this neuroprotective gene would prevent neurodegeneration and cognitive decline, such as in Alzheimer's disease, but also enhance cognition during normal aging, which all of us will be happy to have. What will mean to me to be successful will be to have a drug that will prevent, treat, or cure Alzheimer's disease and other brain diseases, and also save $250 billion today and up to $1 trillion by 2050 in healthcare and also much of human suffering.
Hi, I'm Jessica Winter. I'm a professor in chemical engineering at The Ohio State University. I'm also the Chief Science Officer of Core Quantum Technologies, and I'm the Associate Director of our Materials Research Science and Engineering Center, which is a NSF-funded center, $17 million that, in part, with 4 other NSF grants, helped fund the work that led to my company. So my company's technology is for leukemia and lymphoma diagnostics, and it's based on nanoparticles that we synthesize in the lab that light up. And so we can use those nanoparticles to label some of the biomarkers that Jeb was referring to see which patients have which markers. And then the physician will look at the panel and decide what drug you should get based on which biomarkers you have. So it's an enabling technology to match patients to drugs, which is called personalized medicine. We incorporated in 2012. We've participated in NSF I-Corps program. We've received SBIR funding from NSF. We currently have 3 employees. We're hiring 2 more right now, and we plan to begin sales at the end of this year. So we're very close to the end of that journey. We've actually started thinking about our next product. So using the same technology, completely different field, we can detect bacteria in food stocks for food safety.
Thank you. I'm Andy Hansen, and it was mentioned the company I'm with is HylaPharm, and we're in Lawrence, Kansas. We were spin out from the University of Kansas, and we're based upon research that was funded by NIH and also by the DoD. And basically the research that was originally done was focused on new ways to deliver cancer drugs. Cancer drugs are typically given IV systemically so that the whole body is exposed to the cancer drug. Because of their toxicity, you cannot just directly inject them directly into the tumor. What the professor at KU discovered, and he's our chief scientist, Laird Forrest, is that by covalently binding it to hyaluronic acid, we can now inject it directly into the tumor, and therefore we can get the much higher delivery of the cancer dose right to the tumor where you want it, and also then the systemic exposure to other organs such as the kidney and liver, which usually are what limits the amount of cancer drug you can be given, are much reduced. So we're on the cancer drug delivery side, which is cancer drugs take a lot longer on the time frame than just the diagnostics. So we're still, I would consider, a fairly early company in Lawrence.
Thanks so much for inviting me. My name is Michael Abramov. I'm founder and president of IDX. IDX stands for Iowa Diagnostics and iDiagnostics. My patients call me Dr. Abramov. I'm a retinal specialist, and even 20 years ago, many people with diabetes came into my clinic who suffered visual loss or even blindness. We know very well, if detected early, this can be treated very well. There's no reason, but these patients just were not being discovered. So that needs to be more efficient. When I came to the University of Iowa, I received funding from NIH, from the VA, and even from the USDA to do research on the math background of artificial intelligence to do better. This led to IDX now 5 years ago, and we have a smart retinal camera that takes pictures of the back of the eye, and within minutes diagnoses whether or not the patient has this blinding disease of diabetic retinopathy. It's fully automated. There's no physician involvement, no human involvement, except to help take the pictures. Right now, it's being sold in Europe, so we're exporting already in Europe. We're working with FDA to get it cleared here. We finished a clinical trial a few months ago, hoping for clearance early next year. The potential of AI technology to make an impact in healthcare is enormous. IDX was founded to increase productivity in healthcare. We will not do it if we do not increase it in productivity. And productivity and increases therein is the key to lowering healthcare costs directly. There's a pipeline of other products, including to screen for Alzheimer, all using this same technology. So it's very exciting to be talking about this. Finally, civic duty was mentioned by Dr. Moran. I am an immigrant, as you can hear from my accent. I see it as my civic duty to make healthcare more affordable in this country. And just as my two sons, one of whom is actually in the audience, joined the military. So, we all try to do our best here. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And actually, speaking of the sort of economic development and civic duty part, you have over 20 employees now?
Yeah, we have almost 25 employees if you include the interns. We raised about $20 million in angel funding.
And if you were to look a year ahead, how many employees do you think you'll likely have? If things
Well, if
continue
we
to go
get
well?
clearance, we need hundreds of people immediately in sales and marketing, and we're already looking at that. We're investing in that in a medium way, so to say, but we
Fantastic.
need many more.
So a real impact on the local community. That's great. Great. Bob, thank you.
My name is Bob Hamers. I'm a full-time faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm the co-founder back in 2007 of a company called Silotronics that was founded on the premise of making safer lithium-ion batteries. So you probably all have multiple lithium-ion batteries in your cell phone. So many of the difficulties with lithium-ion batteries, you're aware of the flammability problems. You probably know about the Galaxy Notebook problems, the Boeing Dreamliners being grounded because of battery fires. All of these really arise from uncontrolled chemical reactions in the battery itself. And in particular, there's a component in that called an electrolyte. And that electrolyte has been the same since the invention of the lithium-ion battery in 1991. And the important property of that electrolyte is it is extremely flammable. And so in 2007, we set out to make a set of compounds that would be low flammability and would improve the performance of the lithium-ion battery. So my collaborator and I, Bob West, and I formed this company called Silotronics. And we were originally funded, or the original pre-work came out of a NIST program called the Advanced Technology Program to my collaborator, Bob West. I had been funded through the NSF Single Investigator Program, and we realized that in addition to having the same first name, we actually had perfectly complementary interests in working together. And so we founded the company. We were funded originally by NSF through the SBIR program, Phase 1, Phase 2, and Phase 2B. Like most small companies, we went through hard times at some point, and it was the Office of Naval Research, ONR, that saved us from one of the critical failures of the company was our original compounds had some limitations. Funding from ONR allowed us to generate 2 new generations of chemical compounds, including one called Gen 3 that is a complete home run. And Gen 3 has since gone through rapid expansion, full-scale commercialization, going through the so-called chemical registration process in multiple countries in Asia, because all lithium-ion battery manufacturing essentially is done in Japan, Korea, and China. So we have a partnership right now with Hitachi Chemical for the commercial sense in consumer electronics and electric vehicles, and then with Qualion, which is a US-based specialty battery manufacturer, to qualify our compounds for the MH-60 Seahawk helicopter from the Navy, with the idea of trying to qualify our electrolyte for that helicopter by the end of next year. The company has 23 employees. We recently opened a subsidiary in Tokyo, Japan, again, to have boots on the ground in Asia. The particular area that we're in is essentially a $1 billion market, and we think we can capture maybe a third of that sort of our. We'll try to capture the whole thing, but we'll be happy with a third.
Aim a little higher than
Yeah, right, exactly.
a third of $1 billion. That's great, thanks. I was really struck listening to the panel, even just the breadth of the number of federal agencies that were mentioned, NIST, NIH, NSF, ONR. It really seems like federal funding has played an incredibly important role in all of your companies, even beyond the initial seed corn research at the universities. In some cases, how many folks went through either SBIR, STTR program, some sort? ICOR graduates?
Yep.
Okay, so both from the basic research and on the sort of translational side, the federal funding has played a really important role. If the federal funding hadn't been there, would your companies exist today? Is this the kind of thing that industry just would have done? Would these products have gotten to market?
Can I?
Please.
I think for us, certainly not. I think it comes down to the issue that for a company or for an investor, whichever way you get money, a decision to invest in research is based on an expectation of a relatively short-term return. I mean, I fund other people doing research for us in some very esoteric areas. And I mean, I expect them to develop what I need in a relatively short period of time. I mean, because that's the kind of decision I have to make running a company. But what led to our company and really all these other companies are people going out and doing basic research, expanding our fundamental understanding of the world. Like people like got a better fundamental understanding of the world, and then in many cases like tripped upon some effective use of that fundamental understanding, new fundamental understanding. And because we're the federal government, like for a company, like if I pay for research and they develop something that I don't use, like to me, that's a negative as a company. But as a nation, if we pay for research, whatever gets developed benefits us in increasing our competitiveness and growing our economy. I mean, I feel reasonably certain we will not grow our economy by opening more barbershops and food trucks, right? That's unlikely. We'll grow our economy by doing new things and figuring out new ways to either help people, serve people, protect people. And that's what we learn from basic research, fundamental understanding through basic research.
Great. Jeb, I think you had your hand up. I'll get out of the others in a second.
Sure. I mean, just think of it, you know, from invertebrate, you know, worms under the polar ice cap to biomarkers that are detecting disease early, that are allowing for clinicians to identify and match patients to the drugs, helping biopharma companies to really drive more efficiencies in clinical trials. You know, it's a pretty big, you know, that's a pretty big gap, notwithstanding the 2 decades from start to where we're at right now. And Adam, who was the beneficiary of the NSF grant, $900,000 during the early 2000s, I'm sure as a molecular biologist and a marine environmental scientist, was not thinking about the application of this. What struck me is that the basic research was one thing. The other part was the innovation that he had to come up with to, you know, figure it out while down there in Antarctica, and that the solution was a computational solution, a very sophisticated set of statistical algorithms that in the early days of artificial intelligence and now big data, et cetera, you know, the confluence of the computational power to allow for the iterations needed to drive these computational algorithms to the benefit that they're deriving today was really instrumental to his discovery, going into it not even planning that it would be a computational outcome. So we would not be here had that not happened. And that it did is a great credit to NSF and the government for allowing that type of exploratory work to go on.
Yeah, IDX signed a partnership with IBM Watson about half a year ago, where IDX will create all eye-related automated diagnostics for IBM Watson. And IBM Watson is well known in AI, but they never worked on this. And you know, basic science funding without it would not have happened. And I want to emphasize a specific thing that in universities, I'm a physician and a scientist. I work together with engineers and other scientists. IBM doesn't have many physicians, and there's just no font of knowledge there to do these kinds of things. That's why they had to come to us. So yes, private companies are funding basic science research, but in very specific fields, and not like so very collaborative as you find in universities.
Great. Jessica.
So yeah, I have some facts in front of me. So between 1976 and 2015, over 60% of the patents that were issued in the US referenced papers that came from research. So it's clear that research has a very strong impact on our patent library. And there are $63.7 billion every year allocated to federal government research, which generates 2,600 patents a year and 400 companies. So there's a definite connection. One of the things I wanted to emphasize is we are moving away from the era where we had companies like Bell Labs, where we would have industry support of basic research. And a lot of that is now shifted to the university. And while we want to continue to encourage industry to pursue basic research, I think that we have to recognize that the burden is now falling on universities who generate all of this research that can lead to innovation downstream, whether it's next year or 10 years from now.
Please, Carmela.
As you well know, in Alzheimer's disease, there have been very many failures recently, very sadly. So since we are at the very, very early stages of development of a drug, every time we spoke with VCs or with big pharma, they wanted us only to come back to them when we are in phase 2 clinical trials. So it's very hard to jump from where we are now to directly phase 2 clinical trials without any support in between, also called the Valley of Death, mentioned by a lot of people, but we were very lucky to obtain an SBIR, and this is how we can continue our work.
Yeah, I'll just explain. So the Valley of Death, I'm not sure how many folks in the room are familiar with this concept, so maybe I'll illustrate it by way of a story. Two of our researchers at Columbia in the Department of Pathology had received millions of dollars of NIH funding to work on glioblastoma, on brain cancer. So in this case, it actually was a story that started closer to human health than the Arctic worms. So they knew what they were looking for, and they were trying to find novel compounds to address glioblastoma. And so after years of work and millions of dollars of NIH funding, they came up with a novel compound, ST36, that when injected into mouse models for glioblastoma, so mice that had been engineered to have glioblastoma, the glioblastoma melted away. So it's incredibly exciting work. At that point, we filed some patents on them. Our office started to show those to pretty much every biopharma company and every venture investor in the country, including those that said they were early stage venture capitalists. And we heard very similar responses to what Carmela was telling us. They said, first of all, the mouse model is not the recognized standard for this work, apparently. It had to be in dogs. But the federal funding is for basic research discovery. It's not for redoing this study in new models necessarily. They also said they would vastly prefer us to start a company around this, and they'd rather just buy that company when it reaches phase 2 clinical trials, which required getting an entrepreneur and training that entrepreneur and connecting them to a team and finding that early stage seed capital, none of which existed. So the good news is our office, the University, Columbia, eventually put up some of the money to redo the study for a couple $100,000, and the results were extraordinarily promising. And one of our executives in residence, we happen to be very lucky, have an extraordinarily talented entrepreneur, Barry Capel, who'd just taken his last company public and was looking for his next big thing. He was in our office, came across this project 2 weeks into this research, signed a license with us, raised $23 million within 6 months, and they just got orphan drug approval from the orphan drug indication from the FDA. So they're off to the races. Very, very exciting. The sad part about that is twofold. The Valley of Death is the stage after the federal funding ends, but before the company is ready to be partnered up with industry or receive significant venture capital funding. And sometimes it can last for a really long time. So this drug, this potential drug was sitting for about 4 or 5 years, waiting for those two pieces to come together. And this is a disease that kills 15,000 people a year. So there's real cost to delay. The other sad thing is that was a happy outcome, because eventually it got through the valley, whereas a lot of these companies fail. So that's the explanation of what the Valley of Death is. The company's called Sapience, by the way, if you want to look it up. But I'll ask the panel now. So many universities across the country and many federal agencies are trying to create a more supportive environment on campus for entrepreneurship, whether it's through SBIR programs or I-Corps, subsidized real estate, entrepreneur residence networks, et cetera. And I'm interested from the panel, how many of you participated in some of these campus-based resources to help your company grow and succeed? And you know, which ones did you find most helpful? I'm going to start at the far end with Bob.
Yeah, so it certainly helped us. So our company was an outgrowth of intellectual property and research done at the University of Wisconsin. So our patent holding branch, the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, was actually extremely supportive as we went forward to form the company in a couple of different ways. One was my collaborator and I really did not know anything about starting a company, and so they put us in touch with people who did. They helped us identify a venture capital firm that they thought would be compatible in outlook to what our goals and what we were trying to achieve. They helped us to identify a chief executive officer, again, nominating several people, not making the decision for us, but providing us with some input. But I think the most impactful thing for me was when we got into this Valley of Death a little bit, and the university, or the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, actually made a direct financial investment in the company. So one thing that happens is when you're doing this dual entrepreneur faculty member thing, you get mixed messages about whether you should or should not be doing it, right? And and to have the Alumni Association come in and directly support the company when it's in danger of failing really sent a very strong message that the university really backed that technology transfer idea.
Great, thank you, Bob. Carmela,
Yeah, very short. We have a very good, at Boston.
sorry, into the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. At Boston University, we have a very good Office of Technology Development that helped us a lot with the tech transfer and patent support. I myself received a $50,000 Innovation Award. It is a competition between the faculty, and I was lucky to get one of those. And also, they have something that is called, maybe only BU has, Tech, Drugs, and Rock and Roll, which is maybe twice a year. We all meet and discuss and have posters, and VCs come, and pharma, and together with some music in the bay. So
The world's nerdiest party, I love it. Great, yes, go ahead, Andy.
Our company is receives support at the University of Kansas mainly through the fact that we're actually still located on University of Kansas property in the incubator. I have heard from a lot of these other panelists about, the support they've received from the university, and I think actual financial support from the Alumni Association is actually fairly rare. And I think one thing I want to make clear is I think there might be some selection bias here because the companies that are here are the ones that have been successful. And I think a lot of other universities that aren't representative of up here are the ones that need more help, and that, those are the, not every university can invest in the companies.
Great, go ahead, Jack.
Sure. We were very fortunate to be at Dartmouth. At Dartmouth, there's a very robust entrepreneurship community and supportive entrepreneurship community. At the provost, kind of deputy provost level, there's a deputy provost of entrepreneurship and technology transfer, and it's Eric Fossum. He invented the CMOS camera, which is in all your cell phones. So, he built a company around that, and he built another company after that. So, it's a person. He's a great resource. But then the technology transfer office, Dartmouth has an exceptionally good deal for founders, for scientists to license their own technology. And it's a set piece deal. You can just go in and take it. And it's very, very reasonable. And then there's, like a lot of schools have, there's events you can go to where you get to hear about stuff. Like people talk about various aspects of entrepreneurship. They also, a lot of investors come through, both at Angel and VC. We're lucky to be really overrepresented in VC. So we see a lot of them. But what was super helpful to me was that there's a lot of founders there, people that have started companies in the Dartmouth, both in Hanover and larger Dartmouth community, and just having them as a resource, because I was like super ignorant. Way more than most people. My former life, I was a commando. I used to jump out of planes, like shoot guns, scuba dive, drive cars, stuff like that. Go catch bad guys. Like that was my life before. And so I didn't know anything. So I cannot tell you how helpful it is to go and be able to go to a couple other founders and be like, hey, man, what do you think about like equity? Like, how did you like distribute among founders? What's appropriate for early employees? What's appropriate for later employees? Like, how do you do health insurance? Like, I never even had health insurance before, right? I had a doctor, and I'd be like, hey, dude, come here. I need some medical help. Again, zero, totally ignorant. Like, what's appropriate for paternity and maternity leave? Like, we had an employee whose wife was pregnant. I was like, oh, man, I'm supposed to do something here in the near future. Like, I should probably figure this out. But just that kind of support. And, nobody said this up here, but starting up a company is exceptionally emotionally volatile. Like, there's times you're like, this is awesome. We are killing it. And then, like, 2 hours later, you're like, like, why did I even do this? This was so dumb. I should be working at Home Depot or something right now. So just having the people you can go to and talk about that stuff, and you're like, and they're like, calm down. It's not that big a deal. Everything will be all right. And they help you figure out how it can be all right.
Yeah.
Just that kind of support is super helpful.
Yeah, we always say, like, a lot of this is just pattern not just, but a lot of this is pattern recognition. When you've done your first company or your second, it's different than when you've done 10 or been involved with 100 or invested in 1,000. So, by the way, I'm sure you're much better at running a company than any of us would be at jumping out of an airplane. So I think you should be very proud of yourself. Michael, I think you had something you wanted to.
Yeah, so three things, I think. So patents, I have about 16 patents or maybe 17. You never know exactly, right? So the university has been very helpful for that. They actually allowed the Board of Regents to take a share of the company, which was kind of interesting that the university can own equity. But I think most importantly, and I want to mention that, is the environment. I mean, it's a very collaborative environment at Iowa and many other Midwest universities, as we know. But what is, a pathologist getting an NIH grant doesn't directly help IDX, but it's the environment where researchers collaborate and talk to each other that, even funding a rheumatology project helps my company.
Yeah, that's great. I want to just take a pause for 1 second to touch on something that Michael mentioned. Show of hands, how many companies on the line here have patents? At least one? For how many of you do you feel like your company would not have been founded were it not for those strong patents?
Investor, yeah, I can, investors are very excited about patents.
Right.
We don't know how much protection it gives, but they really look at that as a qualifying for starting an investment. It's really important.
Great.
Moms really like them too. Moms are super proud when you get a patent. They and the investors, like, that's most of the value of the patent. But
There may be other value to the patent, but
that's less clear.
Jeb, you were going to say something.
Yeah, my background's not from the academic community, and this is the first opportunity I've had to work in an entrepreneurial situation from the get-go. I started out with Hewlett-Packard, now Agilent, and then I've been the CEO for 7 successful early-stage through value creation type companies. And my observation at the University of Delaware is that it has an integrated program to really drive innovation from the university into commercialization. And it addresses everything from legal assistance at discounts and patent approach and so forth. So very holistic access to entrepreneurs. And in fact, even incentives to the professor who's the innovator, such that anything that happens downstream, they get 1/3 of. So it's an inspiring type of situation. So I think that's great, right? It gets the the innovation into a path to the market. But this valley of death is something that, although it's a memorable term, I would encourage any of you who are thinking through the steps of assuring that the R&D dollars do result in commercial success. That step is very worthwhile trying to figure out in a much better way than it is right now. Experiencing it, personally here, there aren't a lot of options that exist in terms of access to government funding to really drive that sort of thing. Not necessarily even in the sense of grants, but likewise tax incentives. You've got professors that, want to participate, but they're somewhat constrained at not being able to take a salary, right? You've got, CEOs who some of us can do that if we're motivated and inspired, but, for 2 years there is no salary, right? So that aspect of things is a very real catalyst. We've been able to progressively solve it through attracting seed capital from individuals who've invested with me in the past, some angel investors, now some early investors. We've pursued revenue-generating collaborations with industry, but that's really hard to do. And if you've done it a few times, it's a lot easier than even knowing to think about it for your first time.
Yeah.
So that front end is that valley of death thing that we've been talking about definitely is something from a policy perspective to give some serious thought to.
So, yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
Yes, so I'm going to follow up on Jeb's excellent comment on the Valley of Death. That was the biggest challenge that we face in our company. So when our technology came out, we were approached by 7 different companies who were interested in commercialization, and all of them said we were too early. But at the same time, we weren't far enough along to attract angel or venture capital investment. So you can try to go to your federal grants agency for a regular university grant, and they say, well, that work is incremental because you already showed that it works. You're doing development. That's not what we fund. So you get stuck in this middle place where it's very difficult to move forward. And the key is securing external funding, say angel or venture. But I, as a university professor, am not very skilled at making pitches to angel investors, although I'm much better now than I was. And it's very difficult to attract a CEO or business development person who will lead those efforts because I have no money to pay you because I haven't been able to raise this funding. So it's a very self-perpetuating cycle. And we were able to get SBIR funding and state Ohio funding from Third Frontier, but both of those programs do not permit you to pay CEO salaries. So I'm still not funding that business development person or sales or marketing. Those aspects really don't have a home until I can somehow connect with external funding.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a place where there's a lot of room for improvement, whether it's through additional grant structures that could be introduced to bridge the gap between university grants and SBIRs, or possibly through Department of Development efforts. But there's a place for improvement in that area.
Got it. Thank you. And I'll take one more, Bob, and then we'll move on to the next one.
Just to follow on with Jessica, Jessica is saying that it's difficult sometimes to get venture capital funding. If you are successful in getting venture capital funding, the rules for maintaining SBIR status are such that if your company has more than a certain amount of venture capital funding, even if you have only 3 employees, you're no longer considered a small company. And that's what happened to us. And that almost caused failure, total failure, with almost no way to recover.
Right. So that's actually a really good point. I'm going to, by the way, I'm going to transition to, I've got one last question, though it's a fairly broad one. After that, I'm happy to take questions from the audience. So if you have any, you can start thinking about them. Despite all of the resources that do exist, there are clearly many, many pitfalls that can still, these new companies can fall into. And I know that organizations like Autumn and the Association of University Technology Managers, the Licensing Executive Society, AAU, COGR, APLU are working, and Science Coalition are working very hard to try and innovate new ways of being more helpful. So just by way of example, I mentioned earlier that glioblastoma technology that was largely stalled because we couldn't find an entrepreneur who was sufficiently talented in that field to be able to take it to market. We've recently, a couple of years ago, we and a bunch of our peer institutions around the country decided that it made a lot of sense to merge our entrepreneur networks, because that way when a Columbia oncology company needs an oncologist, we're not limited by the fact that I only have an ophthalmologist and a cybersecurity expert. So now Dartmouth startups can tap into Columbia entrepreneurs, and Columbia startups can tap into Stanford entrepreneurs, and so forth. And I know we've got, I serve on the National Advisory Council for Innovation and Entrepreneurship under the Department of Commerce. Craig in the room runs that program for us back there. But we're talking as a group all the time about ways that the things the federal government could do to make life easier for startups and to encourage more growth. And so the last question that I'll pose to you all is, if you had a magic wand, or if you could make recommendations, let's say you were in Capitol Hill for some reason, and you could make recommendations to Congress on things they could do that would enable more life-changing and life-saving technologies to get out of federal funding and become products in the markets that save people's lives, what are some of those recommendations? Robin, I'll start with you.
Yeah, thank you. One thing that Jessica mentioned was the rules that you have to follow when you receive federal grants in terms of how you can spend that money, and which is purely for research and development. But launching a business, you also have a lot of challenges in terms of building a workforce for marketing, understanding the whole business aspect of crafting a message and selling your product. And so we don't have that much resources to go after those challenges. One exception is the ICOR program from NSF. So we went through that, and that really helped us to adopt this whole lean startup movement and work on customer development from really the beginning and go with this product market fit that help us save pretty much years of effort to really go faster in our productization. So I think one advice I would have is to, ICO is just 7 weeks, but if we could have a program where we can have grants like this on the marketing and customer development side for a longer period of time, more sustained period of time, that would be fantastic.
That's great. Good.
Yeah, so specifically about healthcare, healthcare is based on reimbursement, and so return on investment is based on reimbursement. So I know from organizing competitions for machine learning algorithms that there are hundreds of universities in the US who have very good artificial intelligence for medicine, for better diagnostics without human involvement. The problem is that if you're an investor, you look at ROI, and that means reimbursement, and everyone looks at Medicare for that. That's just the way private insurers look at this market as well. And so what you need is something that can get reimbursement for AI diagnostics. The problem is that everything in Medicare is physician-based, physician effort-based. So if a physician doesn't do effort, which is the case in the technology we develop, there's no way to get it reimbursed, and that makes investors very uncertain. So we have angels, they believe me on my word that this will work and that the business model will work, but it's holding back investments in a large way. Like you had for the internet, there was this boom of investment. You know, that's really waiting for a better reimbursement structure.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
So I would say there's sort of three things that come to mind. One is time, scale, and geography. So in the clean tech area, the time to bring something from a lab conception to even having a chance making it in the marketplace is typically about 8 to 10 years. So this valley of death is a really broad valley. It's also exacerbated by the idea of scale, that the energy industry works on a scale of essentially all energy storage devices are made by a handful of companies, primarily in Asia. And they work on such a large scale that getting their attention to take an idea, a new innovation from the laboratory, and getting it into the attention of the people who actually have the manufacturing resource to actually scale up that invention is really hard. They won't pay attention to you. They're very conservative because when things go wrong, they go wrong in a really big way. And so they want assurances that your new innovation is actually going to work in their environment. And so that's a really hard requirement to match. So I think one of the things that would be really helpful would be to have, number one, have that time for SBR status longer to avoid these problems of VC and loss of SBR funding. But I think more importantly is to set up partnerships that involve a three-way mix. One is to couple the small company both with an academic partner that could be the co-founder, because those companies still need basic science and don't have the resources to pursue it in their company laboratory, nor necessarily do they have the know-how. But then to couple that small company with the larger partner, maybe not the ultimate manufacturing partner, but someone who will be sure and do a reality check and do validation that they're on the right path, and then couple that back almost into a cycle.
Got it. Go ahead, Jeb.
Well, this is more on the fringe of your question, Orin, but, you know, in the spirit of what one can do, I was reflecting on Senator Kuhn's comments about immigration, and we haven't talked about that yet, but one of the observations I've had in discussing this with a number of peers and colleagues in Delaware and Pennsylvania before coming here, sort of their view of what could the government do to improve upon things is get more opportunities to the plate. In other words, the more savvy scientific entrepreneurs that can affect these innovations and new companies, you know, the better the odds are of U.S. innovation. And the nature of the immigration aspect is that we do provide visas for, you know, people outside the country to get through the education process into PhDs, into postdocs, and then the visa ends. And where do the people go? And what I'm understanding is that a lot of those people aspire to continue here, to participate within our environment, and to participate in leveraging that huge education within the United States to benefit our competitiveness. So that to degree, you know, one can reevaluate that in the context of, you know, retaining the innovation education that we've applied to individuals who aspire to stay here but can't. Seems like a real shortfall in taking a huge advantage of immigration opportunity at a time when it's got a lot of visibility. So I encourage that as a potential area.
So
Can I build off those?
Oh, sure. Can Jessica come back in 1 second?
Sure.
Okay, great. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just want to build up the immigration comments. I don't think you can overstate the importance of allowing gifted scientists and engineers to come here. I mean, out of my company, we have 3 scientists and engineers who've come from other countries who play critical role in the company. I mean, critical. One of them already had his U.S. citizenship when he joined us, but because he had done it at an earlier company. But the other 2, I've been doing monkey flips for 3 years. And I mean, it's for an early stage company, it's expensive, it's time consuming. These guys are super important. If they had been forced to leave, it would have been crushing to us. Like, I think we're on track for both of them to have their green cards by Christmas. But I mean, it's been hard. There's been a lot of ups and downs to this, and there's a bunch of other great scientists and engineers that are forced to leave, and we lose their capability. I mean, I think it's critically important.
Massive.
I'm sorry if you were going on the same subject.
Yeah, so I wanted to reinforce everything that's been said there. Our chief R&D engineer is a former graduate student from my lab who was hired by the company through a competitive search, but actually chosen because of his skills. We hit the H-1B jackpot lottery, and we feel very lucky, but he has single-handedly basically developed our product over the last 2 years, and without him, it probably would not have been possible. And since you bring this up, I have more statistics in front of me. But basically, it says that 20% or 1 in 5 graduate students trained at Midwestern universities stays in the Midwest after they graduate. So we are training and building a highly educated PhD level workforce that is staying in these flyover states, one of which I'm from, and helping to build the economies in those areas. So this is a very important aspect. In my department, I would say 50 to maybe even 75% of those students are international students from all countries.
Thanks. Do we have any questions from the audience? Okay. Well, in that case, I think we'll wrap things up. Thanks to everyone for joining us today, but in particular, I'd like to thank the panelists, many of whom have flown in just for this. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you. Really appreciate it. That's all we have. Thank you.